According to the United Nations, by 2050, almost 70% of the global population is expected to live in urban areas, where green spaces are shrinking at an alarming rate. For those of us who love gardening, it's a harsh reality, especially when you're passionate about growing your own food. The space you have is often nowhere near enough to achieve what you dream of. I'm Logan, a 35-year-old who, like many others, felt an immense longing to grow my own food, especially vegetables. There was something about the idea of stepping into my garden and picking fresh tomatoes, peppers, and herbs right from the vines. The problem? I live in a city apartment with a small, cramped balcony. My dream of a lush, green garden was quickly colliding with the limits of my tiny space. It started with excitement. I had this vision of a thriving garden, spilling over with fresh produce. I had grown up around gardens and loved the idea of getting back to my roots. I picked out some seeds, pots, and even a few small plants from a local nursery. That was the easy part. But the reality hit hard when I actually started planting. The little balcony was soon packed with pots, leaving barely enough room to stand, let alone work with the plants. I realized that this space was nowhere near sufficient for what I wanted to achieve. Still, I pressed on, determined to make the most of it. I thought, this will be my own little oasis, and I'll find a way. Weeks passed. And the garden didn't look anything like the ones I saw in magazines or online. The tomatoes were limp, the cucumbers were stunted, and the peppers barely produced anything. The herbs, which were supposed to be the easiest to grow, looked shriveled, struggling to get enough sunlight as they competed with everything else crammed together. I was devastated. I began to notice a growing sense of failure every time I stepped onto that balcony. It felt as though I was fighting against nature, desperately trying to coax life out of this patch of concrete. Every plant was like a constant reminder that I was doing something wrong. That balcony, which was supposed to be my haven, turned into a source of stress and disappointment. And the worst part? No matter how much love and care I poured into those plants, it seemed like there was no hope for improvement. I was spending countless hours researching, adjusting the watering schedules, moving the pots around to catch sunlight, and even talking to the plants. Yes, I was that desperate. But nothing worked. I watched as my neighbors effortlessly grew their flowers and small shrubs, while my garden looked pitiful in comparison. There was this gnawing frustration inside me every time I saw other gardeners post their success stories online. Their lush, vibrant plants seemed to mock me. What was I doing wrong? I felt like a failure, not just as a gardener, but as someone who couldn't seem to make the simplest dream come true. It wasn't just the plants that were suffering. It started to affect my confidence in ways I never expected. Gardening, something that was supposed to bring me peace, joy, and accomplishment, had instead become a daily reminder of my inadequacy. Every morning I would step outside, hoping to see some kind of progress, some sign that my efforts weren't in vain. But every day, it was the same result. The plants were barely clinging to life, and the space I had to work with seemed to get smaller and more suffocating. I remember one day, after another round of rearranging my pathetic excuse for a garden, I just sat down on the cold tiles of the balcony floor and cried. I cried for the dream that seemed to be slipping away, for the time and energy I had wasted, and for the sense of failure that was wrapping itself around me tighter with each passing day. I reached a breaking point when, one morning, I found one of my cucumber plants completely dead. It was as though the plant had just given up, and, in that moment, I felt like giving up too. There were nights when I lay awake thinking, what's the point? Maybe this dream just isn't for me. It was exhausting, emotionally and physically. The defeat was almost tangible, sitting on my shoulders like a heavy weight. Gardening had always been a source of pride for me. When I started, I believed that with the right care, anything could grow. But my limited space had turned that belief into a source of torment. I felt trapped, by the concrete, by the walls of my apartment, by the lack of space, and even by my own determination to make it work when everything was clearly going wrong. It became more than just about the plants. It felt like this garden was a reflection of my life, and the failure of those vegetables to thrive was a sign of my own shortcomings. The enthusiasm I once had for my little balcony garden slowly turned into dread. Each time I watered the plants, moved them around, or pruned their leaves, I did it with a growing sense of despair. I wasn't just trying to grow vegetables anymore, I was trying to prove to myself that I could succeed, even when the odds were stacked against me. But as the weeks went by, and more plants either failed to produce or outright died, that glimmer of hope faded. I remember standing on the balcony one particularly hot summer afternoon, looking over at the few surviving plants. They looked tired, much like I felt. Their leaves drooped in the heat, and the soil in their pots was parched. I had done everything I could, but the truth was staring me in the face: this wasn't working. It wasn't just a garden that was struggling, it was me. My determination, my passion, my belief in myself, they were all wilting under the weight of failure. The hardest part was accepting that, maybe, despite all my efforts, I simply didn't have enough space to create the kind of thriving garden I had dreamed of. I stood there on my balcony, staring at the withering plants. They were clinging to life, much like my fading hope. The summer sun beat down relentlessly, and I felt the weight of it all. Every bit of energy I had poured into my little garden seemed wasted. I had reached the point where giving up felt like the easiest option. But something in me resisted that urge. Maybe it was stubbornness or a deep desire to not let my dream die alongside those plants. Either way, I knew I couldn't just walk away without giving it one last shot. I went inside, sat down at my kitchen table, and started researching again. My fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in terms like maximize small garden space, grow vegetables in tiny areas, high-yield gardening in limited space. I scrolled through article after article, most of which offered the same advice I had already tried. But there was one concept that kept popping up: vertical gardening. At first, I dismissed it. I had seen trellises before but never really considered using them in my small space. It seemed like something for people with yards, not cramped balconies. But as I read more about vertical gardening, the benefits became clear. It was a way to maximize space while still getting the results I wanted. Plants would grow upward instead of outward, allowing me to use every inch of available space. It seemed like a simple, practical solution. But would it really work? The next day, I decided to take the plunge. I went to the local garden center and bought a simple trellis, nothing fancy, just something to get me started. When I got home, I carefully repositioned my plants, giving them more vertical room to grow. I tied the cucumber vines to the trellis and gently guided the tomato plants to climb upward. There was something therapeutic about the process, almost as if I was giving the plants, and myself, a second chance. I watched and waited. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel defeated. Instead, there was a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would work. Within days, I started to see a difference. The plants, which had been struggling to survive, began to perk up. The cucumbers that had barely produced anything before were suddenly growing longer and healthier. The tomatoes, which had been wilting under the weight of their own stems, found support in the trellis and began to grow taller, stronger, and fuller. For the first time, I saw blossoms turning into fruit. I couldn't believe it. It was like a light bulb had switched on in my mind. I had spent months trying to force my garden to fit into the confines of a small balcony, never realizing that I could change the way I used the space entirely. By growing vertically, I wasn't just giving the plants more room, I was giving them the environment they needed to thrive. And in doing so, I was also giving myself a sense of accomplishment that I hadn't felt in months. I started to explore more ways to use the vertical space. I added hanging pots, stacked planters, and even attached a few more trellises to the wall. I was amazed by how much I could grow in such a limited area. What once seemed impossible was suddenly within reach. My small balcony had transformed into a lush, green oasis, overflowing with fresh vegetables and herbs. And the best part? didn't feel trapped anymore. Instead of being weighed down by the limits of my space, I felt empowered by how I had adapted. This newfound success wasn't just about the garden, it was about me. I had overcome the frustration and failure that had held me back for so long. The act of nurturing those plants and watching them grow taught me resilience. It reminded me that even when things seem hopeless, there's always a way forward. You just have to be willing to look at the problem from a different angle and try something new. Of course, I didn't do it alone. There were countless resources I leaned on to get through this difficult period. I connected with online gardening communities, where people shared their own stories of overcoming small space gardening challenges. I found inspiration from others who had turned their tiny balconies into productive vegetable gardens. And I learned from every mistake I made along the way, adjusting and refining my approach with each passing day. But none of it compared to the transformation that came when I stumbled across a particular guide that changed everything: Vertical Veggie Magic, Maximize Yields in Small Gardens with Trellises. It was more than just a book, it was like someone had handed me a roadmap to success. This wasn't just about stacking pots or hanging planters. It was about understanding how to make the most out of vertical gardening in ways I had never imagined. The book broke down the concept in such a simple, easy-to-understand way. From the very first chapter, I found myself thinking, why didn't I do this sooner? It guided me step by step through the process, from selecting the right plants for vertical growth to the types of trellises and supports I needed to maximize yields. And it wasn't just theoretical. The tips in the book were practical, actionable, and designed for people like me who were struggling with limited space but had a burning desire to grow more. Within weeks of implementing the techniques I learned, my small garden had completely transformed. The once sad, struggling plants were now thriving, producing more vegetables than I had ever thought possible in such a small area. The book taught me how to use every inch of space effectively, making my garden feel much bigger than it was. I learned about plant selection, spacing, and how to care for each vegetable to ensure maximum yield. It was everything I needed, all in one place. If you're like me and you've been feeling frustrated with the limitations of small space gardening, I can't recommend this book enough. It gave me the tools I needed to turn my tiny balcony into a thriving garden, and I know it can do the same for you. The strategies in Vertical Veggie Magic are truly game-changing, and the best part is that you can get a digital copy of the book at libriffy.com, the link is in the description. Trust me, if you've been struggling like I was, this book could be the breakthrough you've been waiting for.
Lost in time like waves at sea.